Hey guys, welcome to Just Sleep Stories, and tonight we are sailing somewhere deeply, profoundly, chemically specific. We're going to the suburbs. Not just any suburbs, the ones with the avocado green appliances and the carpets that haven't been vacuumed since Nixon was in office. Tonight we're talking about the Quaalude-addicted housewife of 1970s suburban America. The woman with the perfect hair, the perfect smile, the perfectly mixed drink at 11 in the morning, and an absolutely catastrophic relationship with a little white pill that her doctor handed her like a parking ticket. Now, before you get too comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. It means more than you know. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is, because someone right now is in bed at 2 in the morning eating crackers and watching this, and I love that for you. If someone suggested tonight's topic, thank you. I owe you a Jell-O mould and a passive-aggressive casserole. And now that you're settling in, let me ask you a few things. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to be a housewife in 1973, smiling at a Tupperware party while your nervous system was somewhere in a completely different zip code? Did these women actually enjoy the fondue? Or were they just deeply, profoundly medicated? What exactly does a Quaalude feel like when paired with a Harvey Wallbanger at noon? Did anyone notice? Did anyone care? Were the kids fine? Spoiler, the kids were not entirely fine. Could you spend your entire day cleaning things that were already clean, driving a wood-panelled station wagon to the grocery store, and attending a dinner party where the host wore a hostess gown and everyone politely pretended the world wasn't on fire? And what happens when the pills run out? Congratulations. You have just woken up in 1973. You're in a split-level ranch home somewhere in the suburbs of Ohio, or Connecticut, or anywhere really. They all look the same. There's a casserole in the oven. There's a prescription bottle in the bathroom cabinet. And your husband left for work 45 minutes ago without saying goodbye. Let's begin. Let's start at the beginning, or what everyone agreed to call the beginning. You did not choose this house so much as it chose you, the way bad decisions tend to do when you're 23 and recently married, and everyone around you is doing the exact same thing. The house is a 3-bedroom split level in a subdivision, with a name like Meadowbrook Estates or Willow Glen, or some other combination of words designed to suggest nature in a place where all the nature has been paved over. The lawn is green because your husband fertilizes it on weekends with a kind of grim, silent dedication, usually reserved for religious observance. The shutters are painted a colour the hardware store called colonial blue. The neighbours have shutters in the same colour because that was the only option. From the outside, everything is perfect. From the inside, everything is also technically perfect, which is somehow worse. The living room has a sectional sofa in a colour called harvest gold, which sounds like something you'd find at the end of a fairy tale but looks, in practice, like mustard made a commitment. There's a conversation pit in the more ambitious houses on the street. A sunken square of carpet surrounded by low cushions that was designed to suggest sophistication and achieves, instead, the vibe of a very expensive hole. You do not have a conversation pit. You have a sofa, a coffee table with a glass top, and a centerpiece bowl filled with decorative fruit that no one is allowed to eat because it is decorative, which is the 1970s way of saying it has transcended its original purpose and become art. The kitchen is avocado green. The appliances, refrigerator, stove, dishwasher are all avocado green, a colour that was selected by someone at a design meeting in 1968 and then distributed across the entire American domestic landscape, with the confidence of a decision that has never once been questioned. The countertops are a laminate that was described in the showroom as Mediterranean tile look, which means it looks like someone photographed tile from a great distance and then printed the photograph on plastic. You clean it every morning. It looks the same every morning. You clean it again. The bedrooms are carpeted in a deep shag that holds onto everything: crumbs, pet hair, the small plastic components of board games, and a general sense of the decade, with the commitment of something that was never designed to let go. Vacuuming the shag is a 20-minute project that requires an attachment and a kind of spiritual resolve. You do it on Thursdays. It looks perfect for approximately 4 hours. What nobody tells you before you move in is that the house will require a continuous performance. Not cleaning exactly, though there is constant cleaning, but the performance of having cleaned, of having arranged, of having made everything look effortless. The neighbours walk by with their dogs and glance at your lawn and your shutters and your tasteful wreath on the door, and you glance back and everyone nods, and everyone is performing for everyone else simultaneously, an audience of performers with no actual audience except each other. There is a word for this, but it hasn't been invented yet in the vocabulary available to you in 1973. You will not find it in Good Housekeeping. You will not find it at the Tuesday Coffee Circle. You will find it years later in a book someone hands you at the right moment, and when you read it you will think, yes, that is exactly what that was. But for now, the shutters are colonial blue. The lawn is fertilised. The fruit in the bowl is decorative. And everything is perfect, which is not the same as everything being fine. Every day begins in the dark. Not the romantic kind of dark. Not the soft, dewy pre-dawn of someone who does yoga and has their life together. This is the kind of dark where you wake up at 5:30 because your body has simply decided that sleep is a treat you no longer deserve. You lie there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, listening to your husband breathe the deep, unbothered sleep of someone who has never once wondered if the chicken is defrosted. Then you get up. You put on a housecoat, not a robe, a housecoat, which is a garment designed specifically to say I am technically dressed, but I have not yet consented to the day. You pad down to the kitchen in slippers. The linoleum is cold. You put on the percolator, and then, very quietly, you open the medicine cabinet. The bathroom in the early morning is a specific kind of quiet. The children are asleep. The house settles around you with the small sounds of a structure that has accepted its situation. The fluorescent light above the vanity flickers once before committing, which it does every morning, and every morning you think you should mention it to your husband, and every morning you do not. The medicine cabinet is white. It contains aspirin, a thermometer, Band-Aids in a variety of sizes, a bottle of Pepto-Bismol that is 3/4 empty, your husband's Brill cream, and the prescription bottle, which you pick up and shake, a light rattle, enough for the day, and feel something that is not quite relief but is in the same neighbourhood, which is good enough. You take the pill with tap water, straight from the faucet, because getting a glass would involve turning on more lights and making more noise, and right now the house belongs to you, and you would like to keep it that way for a few more minutes. You stand in the dark kitchen and wait for the percolator, and look out the window at the backyard, which is indistinct in the pre-dawn, just shapes and shadows. The swing set a silhouette. Somewhere on the street a dog barks twice and stops. A car starts in a neighbour's driveway. Someone with an early commute. Someone whose life you know nothing about except that they leave before sunrise, which is its own kind of information. By the time the percolator is done, the sky outside has gone from black to the particular grey-blue of early morning, the colour of a decision not yet made. You pour your coffee. You stand at the counter and drink it, and the pill begins its slow work in the edges of the morning, round themselves off slightly, like a photograph coming into focus, or maybe out of focus, depending on how you look at it. You make a list. You always make a list. Grocery store, dry cleaner, pick up children at 3:15, defrost the chicken, call your mother back, buy more light bulbs for the bathroom fixture. The list is the architecture of the day. Without the list, the day is just time, and time without a list is the kind of open space that starts to ask questions you're not prepared to answer before your second cup of coffee. By 6:15 the house stirs. A small foot hits the floor upstairs. A door opens. The day has begun, with or without your consent, and you are dressed for it. Housecoat, slippers, coffee, one pill already dissolving quietly into the morning. You are ready. Or something that looks, from the outside, exactly like ready. Which, in 1973, is close enough. The Quaalude did not announce itself as a catastrophe. That's the thing about catastrophes in the 1970s. They tended to arrive in child-proof bottles with a doctor's signature on the label, which meant they were, technically, fine. Methaqualone, which is what Quaaludes actually were, a sedative hypnotic originally developed in the 1950s as a safer alternative to barbiturates, which is like saying this particular cliff is a safer alternative to that other cliff, was prescribed by general practitioners across America for anxiety, insomnia, and what was often clinically described as nervousness. If you were a housewife in suburban America in the early 1970s, nervousness was a pre-existing condition. The pills made everything softer, quieter. The edges of the kitchen rounded themselves off. The ticking of the clock became pleasant rather than accusatory. You could fold laundry and feel, briefly, like folding laundry was exactly the right thing to be doing with your one wild and precious life. The pill was small, white, slightly chalky if you held it too long in your fingers, which you learned not to do. The bottle it came in was orange. The label typed in a font that felt official, clinical, trustworthy. Your name, the doctor's name, the pharmacy address, the instructions. Take one tablet by mouth as needed. As needed. Such a generous instruction. Such a wide door. The question of when something was needed was entirely yours to answer, and you found, over time, that your definition of needed was expanding in the way that all definitions expand when they are not examined too closely. What Quaaludes actually did, pharmacologically speaking, was depress the central nervous system, slow everything down, reduce inhibition, produce a sedated euphoria that felt, to the people experiencing it, like being wrapped in something warm and forgiving. Think of it as your nervous system putting on a very comfortable cardigan and deciding not to answer the phone for a while. The anxiety that had been sitting in the corner of every room, not screaming, just present, like a guest who never left, simply receded. The house was still the same house. The obligations were still the obligations, but they were farther away, manageable, almost interesting. There was a quality to the early weeks of the prescription that you would not be able to adequately describe to someone who hadn't experienced it. The specific relief of a body that has been braced for something and is finally briefly allowed to unclench. Like taking off shoes you've been wearing too long. Like exhaling after holding your breath for a year. It wasn't happiness exactly. It was the absence of a specific unhappiness, which sounds like a small thing until you've been carrying the unhappiness long enough to forget it wasn't always there. By 1973, Quaaludes were everywhere in American culture, in college dorms, at parties, in medicine cabinets across the country. They were called sopos, ludes, disco biscuits, because they had also discovered a second life in the nightlife of cities you did not live in. Rock musicians were photographed with them. They appeared in movies. They had a cultural presence that made them feel almost aspirational, which is a stunning piece of marketing work for a drug that your doctor prescribed you for nervous exhaustion. The love story, as love stories go, was not a healthy one. It followed the classic pattern. Wonderful in the beginning, gradually requiring more to produce the same feeling, slowly becoming something you organised your day around without quite deciding to. Not a villain, not a saviour, something in between, which is where the complicated things always live. 6:50 in the morning, and the house is awake now whether you like it or not. Children materialise from their bedrooms in various states of incompletion. One shoe, wrong shirt, hair like a small electrical storm. Your husband appears in his suit, already reading the newspaper, because men in 1973 read the newspaper at the breakfast table as a constitutional right. You stand at the stove in your housecoat making eggs that nobody asked for, but everybody will eat without comment. Nobody says good morning like they mean it. The children fight about something small and inexplicable. Who touched whose cereal, the geopolitics of a shared sock drawer. Your husband turns a page. You slide eggs onto plates. You smile at nothing in particular, and the pill taken 45 minutes ago has begun its gentle work, smoothing everything down like a warm hand on a wrinkled tablecloth. The breakfast table in a 1970s suburban household operates according to an unspoken hierarchy that is rigid, invisible, and understood by everyone. Your husband sits at the head of the table, not because it was assigned, but because it has simply always been that way, gravity and tradition conspiring to place him there. He has orange juice, he has coffee, he has the newspaper folded to the section he wants, which is not the recipe section. The children sit on the sides, arranged by some internal logic involving arguing distance. You stand at the stove, and then at the counter, and then briefly at the table before getting up to get the thing you forgot, and then back at the counter, and nobody notices this pattern because it is the furniture of mornings, invisible and load-bearing. The eggs take 4 minutes. In 4 minutes you have also poured 3 glasses of orange juice, located the missing shoe under the kitchen radiator, reminded the children twice about permission slips, checked whether the dry cleaning is ready, and made a mental note that you're almost out of bread. You have not sat down. Sitting down at breakfast is not part of the performance. Sitting down would suggest you are a participant rather than the infrastructure, and these are not the same thing. Looks good, your husband says, which is what he says every morning regardless of what is on the plate, the highest possible compliment, and also the entirety of the review. The children eat with the focused efficiency of people who have somewhere to be, who are, in fact, the only people at the table with somewhere they're genuinely required to be, which strikes you occasionally as a funny thing that you do not mention. You eat standing at the counter because your plate is there, and because sitting down would require moving it, and the window over the counter has the morning light in it, and that is yours. By 7:15 they are gone. The door closes. The house absorbs the silence like it always does, quickly, completely without comment. You stand at the kitchen table looking at the plates, the crumbs, the empty orange juice glasses, the newspaper section left open to a story about something that happened somewhere else to people who are not you. You stack the plates, you run the water, and the morning, which started before anyone else was awake, continues in the particular direction it always goes, forward, steadily, toward noon. He was not a villain. That's important to say. He drove a sensible car. He mowed the lawn. He showed up to the children's school events with the expression of a man who was genuinely trying. He believed, with some sincerity, that providing a house and a steady paycheck and a colour television was the complete and total definition of love, and nobody in his world had ever suggested otherwise. He didn't ask how you were feeling because asking how someone was feeling had not yet been invented as a concept for men of his particular generation. He was a product of his time, which is what we say about people when what we mean is he had no idea what was happening 2 feet to his left, and also possibly no framework to understand it even if someone explained it clearly using hand puppets and a diagram. He had grown up in a house where his mother made the meals, and his father read the newspaper, and nobody discussed their interior life, because the interior life was not a topic that appeared on the agenda. He had taken this model and replicated it faithfully, the way people do when the model is the only one they have ever seen, which is to say, not maliciously, not even consciously, but with the complete thoroughness of someone who has never been given a reason to question the floor plan. He worked hard. This was genuine and should be acknowledged. He left the house every morning at 7:30 and came home at 6, and in between those hours he did whatever it was that he did at the office. Something with accounts, something with figures, something that involved a briefcase and a parking spot and colleagues he referred to by last name only. He was tired when he came home. You were also tired when he came home, but there is a crucial asymmetry in the 1970s household where one person's tiredness ends the workday and the other person's tiredness is simply the condition under which dinner is still made. He was not unkind, this matters. He did not shout, he did not belittle. He said looks good about the dinner the same way he said it about the breakfast, the high flat compliment of a man who's been trained to register satisfaction without specificity. On Saturdays sometimes he would suggest they watch something together on television, and you would sit on the Harvest Gold sectional, and he would put his arm around you in the comfortable, habitual way of someone who's been sleeping next to the same person for 9 years, and it was not nothing. It was genuinely something. It just wasn't everything, and the distance between something and everything was where you lived. He noticed the prescription bottle once, picked it up from the bathroom counter, turned it over, set it down. He said nothing. Whether this was because he trusted the doctor, or because he did not want to open conversation he didn't know how to have, or because he had decided that if the prescription came from a professional, then the professional was responsible, you could never quite determine which. Probably some layered combination of all three, in the way that most of the things men of his generation decided not to address were layered combinations of several types of not looking. He meant well. You believe that then, and believe it still. The tragedy of meaning well without knowing how to look is not that it is evil. It is that it is so very quiet. If the highway was the artery of suburban America, the neighborhood ladies were the nervous system. They knew everything, who had gone back to the doctor twice in 1 month, whose husband came home late on Thursdays, whose kids were difficult. They exchanged this information the way governments exchange intelligence, carefully, with plausible deniability, over coffee and Danish. The Tuesday coffee circle at Diane's house was not a social gathering so much as an institution, a soft-carpeted parliament where the real decisions of the street were quietly made. You were part of it, of course. You brought the good coffee cake, the one with the streusel, and you sat in Diane's sunken living room on a Harvest Gold sectional, and you talked, and you listened, and you noticed very quietly that at least 3 of the women in the room had the same particular softness around the eyes that you suspected had the same pharmaceutical origin as your own. There were 6 of you in the regular rotation, though the circle had outer members who appeared occasionally and were absorbed without ceremony. Diane was the centre of gravity, not elected, not announced, simply the woman whose house you met at, which in the social mathematics of the suburbs amounts to the same thing as leadership. She had the best coffee and the most comfortable sofa, and an easy laugh that made everyone feel, briefly, that they were the most interesting person she had spoken to all week. She was also watching everything, all the time, with the quiet attention of someone who has decided that information is the only real resource available to her, which in 1973 was an accurate assessment. There was Carol, who had 3 children under 6 and moved through every room like she was slightly underwater, which was less a pharmaceutical condition and more the natural result of not having slept in 5 years. There was Barbara, whose husband travelled for work and who had therefore developed an independence that the rest of you regarded with a complicated mixture of envy and concern. There was Patty, who always brought store-bought cookies and then apologised for bringing store-bought cookies and then brought store-bought cookies again the following week, a cycle that had been running for 2 years without resolution. And there was Janet, who was the youngest, who was 26, who had recently started talking about getting a job, and who was regarded by the rest of the circle with the cautious curiosity of people, watching someone attempt something that hasn't been tested locally. The conversation at these gatherings moved in circles of its own. children, recipes, husbands, the new family on Birchwood Drive, the situation with the Henderson's dog. Nobody talked about anything real. Or rather, everything they talked about was real. The children and the recipes and the husbands were absolutely real. They were the material of their lives, but the conversations lived on the surface of things and stayed there by mutual unspoken agreement. The way you stay on the surface of water when you don't know how deep it goes. And yet, in the gaps between the sentences, in the particular way someone refilled their cup or let a silence run a half second too long, things were communicated that could never be spoken directly. You all knew more about each other than you could admit to knowing. You were a group of women who understood each other completely and could not say so, which is one of the lonelier arrangements human beings have ever devised. You brought the streusel coffee cake. They said it was the best coffee cake. You smiled and accepted the compliment and poured more coffee, and the Tuesday morning continued, comfortable and precise and almost enough. Tuesday mornings were for the grocery store, and the grocery store was its own kind of existential experience even under ideal circumstances. Picture the 1973 American supermarket. Fluorescent lights humming like large disappointed insects, the smell of industrial cleaning fluid and packaged meat, music playing softly, something by Percy Faith, at a volume specifically calibrated to make you feel you were being processed through a very pleasant machine. You pushed the cart, you consulted the list, you selected items with the careful focus of someone navigating a very important mission. And the pill made all of this feel, if not exactly wonderful, then at least manageable. The hard fluorescent edges softened to something more like watercolours. You bought 3 cans of cream of mushroom soup. You could not remember why you needed 3. You bought them anyway. The grocery store in the suburbs of 1973 was enormous by the standards of what came before it, and modest by the standards of what would come after. The canned goods aisle alone was a wall of identical labels stretching into a distance that felt philosophical. Campbell's soup in 17 varieties, Del Monte vegetables in their modest tin suits, Jell-O in every colour the rainbow had ever considered, plus a few it hadn't. You knew this store the way you knew your own house, every aisle by instinct, every price by memory, and you moved through it in the slightly unhurried way that the pill made possible. Not slow exactly, but deliberate, like someone who has decided that the journey is as important as the destination, which was not something you had decided but was, in the soft pharmaceutical morning, something your body had arranged on its behalf. You ran into Linda Kowalski in the cereal aisle. Linda was the kind of woman who always ran into you in the cereal aisle, who had the energy of someone who'd been awake since 4 and enjoyed it. She told you about the sale on pot roast. She asked about your children. She mentioned a recipe involving cream of mushroom soup, which explained the 3 cans, not remembered, but somehow stored, an instruction absorbed in a prior conversation and executed on a delay. You thanked her for the recipe you did not have. You added pot roast to the cart. This is what the 1970s called a social interaction, and you performed it fluently, with the practiced ease of someone who has been doing this long enough that it happens in the front of the mind, while the rest of the mind is somewhere quiet and warm and very far away. The checkout line was its own small theatre. You unloaded the cart onto the conveyor belt in the order things should be packed. Cans first, bread last, eggs never under anything. A logic so ingrained it happened without thought. The cashier was a teenager with a name tag that said Steve, who scanned your items with the existential indifference of someone who had recently discovered that the universe was meaningless and was taking it professionally. The receipt was long. The total was higher than you expected, which it always was. You paid with cash from the envelope your husband left on the kitchen counter on Monday. Mornings, the household allowance, which was a system so perfectly designed to remind you of your position in the financial hierarchy that it almost seemed intentional. You pushed the cart to the car. You loaded the bags into the back of the station wagon. You sat for a moment before starting the engine in the particular stillness of a parking lot on a Tuesday morning, and you felt the warm pharmaceutical distance between yourself and everything, and you thought, "This is fine. This is all fine." You turned the key. The radio came on. Somebody on the AM station was playing something cheerful. You drove home. Dinner was not just dinner. In 1973 suburban America, dinner was a performance, a proof of concept, a daily referendum on your value as a human being, and the casserole was your primary medium of self-expression. The casserole asked nothing of you philosophically. It did not require inspirational vision. It required a can opener, a 9x13 Pyrex dish, and enough cream of mushroom soup to fill a small swimming pool, which you had, because you had bought 3 cans on Tuesday without knowing why, and now you knew why. You made the tuna noodle at least twice a week. You made the green bean with the crispy onions on top, which your husband called the good one because it was the only one he could name. You made the hamburger and potato, which the children ate without speaking. You stood at the counter and made all of these things and felt, somewhere beneath the warm pharmaceutical haze, that you were very, very competent at something. The casserole has a long and largely underappreciated history as a form of emotional management. Consider, it requires a predictable sequence of actions that can be performed on autopilot, leaving the mind free to roam. It produces visible, quantifiable results. A full dish, a fed family, a clean counter afterward. It is warm. It is reliable. It does not have opinions. In a life full of variables, the casserole is the constant, and there is genuine comfort in that. The same comfort you might get from doing a jigsaw puzzle or reorganizing the Tupperware drawer, which you also did regularly as a separate therapeutic exercise. The recipes came from 3 sources: the Betty Crocker cookbook on the shelf, the clipping file you kept in a folder in the kitchen drawer, and the Tuesday Coffee Circle, which operated a robust informal recipe exchange. Diane had given you the green bean casserole recipe in 1971, and you'd been making it ever since with the loyalty of someone who understands that a reliable recipe is a form of friendship. The tuna noodle was your mother's, transferred to index card in your own handwriting at some point before the marriage, a piece of domestic inheritance passed down through the female line like a gene for stubbornness. By 4:30 the oven was on. This was the signal, the daily marker that the second half of the day had begun. The first half being everything before the children came home, the second half being everything after. You moved around the kitchen with the efficient ease of long practice. Can opened, noodles boiled, Pyrex dish retrieved from the cabinet where it always lived. Cream of mushroom measured and mixed with the approximate accuracy of someone who has made this dish 40 times and no longer needs the recipe to tell them anything. The smell of a casserole in the oven does something specific to a house, fills it, warms it, makes it smell like a place where people are cared for. You had noticed this early in the marriage and never stopped relying on it. The family ate at 6. Your husband said, "Looks good." The children ate without speaking, which was its own kind of compliment. You ate standing at the counter again, telling yourself you'd sit when you got a moment, never quite getting the moment. The dish went back in the refrigerator. The oven got wiped down. The Pyrex went into soak. Another dinner, performed and completed, the evidence cleared away. Tomorrow there would be another. This was the long, repetitive, essential work of keeping everyone alive and warm and fed, which is not a small thing, even if nobody called it by its right name. Here is something that will keep you awake tonight, or possibly put you to sleep, depending on your relationship with the healthcare system. In 1973, getting a prescription for Quaaludes was, for many women, roughly as complicated as getting a library card. You went to your GP, a man, almost certainly a man, and you said you were having trouble sleeping, or you were anxious, or you were, In the clinical terminology of the era, nervous, and he nodded with the practiced empathy of someone who had heard this 17 times today and wrote you a prescription in about 45 seconds. He may have said something like this will take the edge off. He did not ask what specifically the edge was. He did not inquire about the dimensions of the edge, or whether perhaps the edge was a symptom of something larger. The edge was your problem. The pill was his solution. Here's your prescription. Here's a smile. Have a nice day. The pharmacy was 3 blocks from your house. You could walk. To understand how this happened on such an enormous scale, you have to understand the medical culture of the post-war American decades, which operated on several assumptions that would later prove to be complications, that the doctor was the authority, that the patient was the recipient of that authority, and that women, particularly wives, particularly mothers, were constitutionally prone to anxiety and nervousness in a way that required pharmaceutical management rather than structural examination. The question, why are so many women in the suburbs nervous, was not asked. The question here is a pill that will make them less nervous was the beginning and end of the conversation. By 1973, an estimated 1 in 5 American women had been prescribed some form of tranquilizer or sedative. That number is worth sitting with. Not 1 in 50, 1 in 5. Which means that at your Tuesday coffee circle of 6 women, statistically speaking, more than one of you was holding a prescription. And if the soft particular look around the eyes was any indication, the statistics were conservative. You were not an anomaly. You were not a cautionary tale. Not yet. You were, in the language of the pharmaceutical industry and the medical establishment, a satisfied customer. The pharmacist knew you by name. He was a man named Gerald with a beige coat and a very organised counter, and the professional warmth of someone who has decided to be kind to everyone equally, which is a form of kindness that doesn't actually see you, but is better than the alternative. He filled the prescription in 5 minutes. He stapled the bag shut. He said, "Have a good one," with the automatic sincerity of a person who has said this 10,000 times. You said, "Thank you, Gerald," and put the bag in your purse and walked out into the parking lot where the car was waiting and the day was waiting and the next bottle was now in your possession, and everything was, in the particular 1970s medical sense of the word, fine. The thing about a prescription is that it carries a moral weight that buying the same thing on a street corner would not. The prescription says, a professional assessed you and determined this was necessary. It says, this is medicine, not weakness. It says, you're being treated, which implies there is a doctor watching, which implies you're being cared for. None of these things were quite true in the way they appeared to be, but the bottle had your name on it in official type, and official type has always been very convincing. The children of the neighbourhood arrived at your house on Thursday afternoon with the particular energy of small mammals who have had too much sugar and not enough consequences, and you, equipped with your afternoon pill and a plate of Chips Ahoy, managed the situation with the slightly underwater calm of a nature documentary narrator describing a stampede from a safe distance. The playdate was a social institution of suburban motherhood. You were not just caring for children, you were performing the care of children in front of other mothers who might drop by and witness your performance. You made sure the playroom was tidy. You cut the sandwiches into triangles because triangles read as effort. You mediated the dispute over the Etch-A sketch with the serene detachment of a UN ambassador. You smiled and poured high C. And somewhere under all of it, a small part of your brain was sitting in a quiet room by itself, reading a book nobody had assigned. There were 4 of them today. Your 2 plus the Henderson kids from next door, Tommy who was 9 and perpetually in a conflict with the world, and Sarah who was 7 and had recently decided that the correct response to all difficulties was to cry immediately and loudly, a strategy that was surprisingly effective. They arrange themselves in the playroom with a quick, instinctive territorial organization of small people who do this every week and have therefore already settled the question of who controls which corner. The Etch-a-Sketch was contested territory. It was always contested territory. You kept one ear on the playroom and the rest of yourself in the kitchen, where the afternoon had a particular quality of light that you liked. The sun coming in at an angle through the window over the sink, landing on the counter in a way that made the avocado green surface look almost warm, almost like something you might have chosen on purpose. You washed the lunch dishes, you dried them. You thought about nothing specific, which the pill made easy. The pharmaceutical equivalent of a mental snow day. All the usual traffic of worry and obligation reduced to a soft white static. The rules of a successful playdate were simple and absolute. Nobody bleeds, nobody cries for more than 30 seconds, nobody calls their mother to come get them early, and nothing of sentimental value gets broken. You had learned these rules through experience, the way all rules worth knowing are learned. The Etch-a-Sketch dispute escalated briefly. Voices, then a thump, then your daughter using her most formal voice to announce that Tommy had shaken it, and you appeared in the doorway of the playroom with the calm authority of someone who has taken an afternoon pill, and has therefore temporarily transcended the petty logistics of conflict. Take turns, you said, 5 minutes each. They accepted this without protest, because there is something about absolute serenity in an adult that children, who are used to adults performing agitation, find surprisingly compelling. You retreated to the kitchen. The Etch-a-Sketch was past. Peace was restored. At 4:30 the mothers came to collect their children. You exchanged the brief, warm pleasantries of the doorstep. Were they good? Perfect, of course. You're so patient. Oh, not at all. The ritual deflection of compliments between women who both know the compliment is currency and the deflection is grace. The house went quiet as the Henderson kids left. Your own children drifted to the television. You stood in the hallway for a moment in the sudden, specific silence of a house that has recently been full of noise and is now empty of it, which has its own quality, its own sound, which is not quite peace but is the shape of it. You collected the high C cups. You picked the Chips Ahoy plate up from the playroom floor. You noted that Tommy had drawn something on the corner of your coffee table with a crayon which you would address with his mother at the next Tuesday coffee circle, using the gentle, indirect language of women who have grievances and have learned to deliver them as observations. All in all, a successful Thursday. Nobody bled. Nobody called their mother. The triangles had, by all evidence, read as effort. You called that a win. She arrived on a Wednesday, the Avon lady, clicking up the front walk in heels and a polyester blazer the colour of a sunset that had given up trying, carrying a bag full of samples and an energy that suggested she had recently taken the exact opposite of what you had taken. Her name was either Pamela or Janet. Every Avon lady was either Pamela or Janet. You let her in. You sat across from her at the kitchen table, while she laid out lipsticks and cold cream and little bottles of perfume with names like Somewhere an Evening Promise, and you considered purchasing all of them on the grounds that they implied that evenings could promise things. You bought the cold cream and a lipstick in coral, which you did not strictly need, because buying the lipstick was a transaction that involved being seen by another human being and acknowledged as someone who might use lipstick, and some days that was enough. The Avon lady was, in the architecture of 1970s suburban life, a specific and underappreciated figure. She was one of the few women on the street who had a job that was entirely her own, not a career exactly, not in the way the word would come to be used, but an enterprise, a territory, a reason to be somewhere at a specific time with a specific purpose that had nothing to do with anyone else's lunch. She knocked on your door, and you opened it, and for 45 minutes she ran. The meeting, she set the agenda. She made the decisions about what to show you and in what order. And she did it all in a polyester blazer on a Wednesday afternoon with the confidence of a woman who has decided that her time is valuable and has organised her day accordingly. You found this quietly thrilling in a way you would not have known how to explain. The catalogue was a document of aspiration. Roses perfume in the frosted bottle, the skin, so soft bath oil that everyone's mother used, and that smelled like the concept of being taken care of. The lipsticks in their gold tubes, with names like berry wine and apricot blush and first love, which was a colour for a feeling you were not currently having, but could apparently purchase. You turned the pages while Pamela or Janet talked about the new moisturiser and the holiday gift sets, and you thought about the women in the catalogue photographs, who were all smiling in the soft focus way of people who have never once thought about whether the chicken was defrosted. You bought more than you intended to, which was the point of the visit, and which you understood even while it was happening. The cold cream, yes, and the coral lipstick, and at the last moment a small bottle of somewhere perfume, because the name felt like a complete sentence, and you like the weight of the bottle in your hand. $23.50, which was real money in 1973 and which you paid from the kitchen drawer envelope without quite accounting for it in your mental budget, which was a small rebellion so minor it barely qualified, but which was yours. Pamela or Janet packed her samples back into the bag with practiced efficiency, snapped it shut, and stood up from the kitchen table with the particular energy of a woman who had 3 more houses to visit before 4 o'clock. You walked her to the door. She said she'd be back in 6 weeks. You said you'd look forward to it, which was true in the specific way that small anticipated pleasures are true, not life-changing, not dramatic, but genuinely real. The door closed. The house was quiet again. You put the coral lipstick in the bathroom cabinet next to the prescription bottle. 2 small objects in a white interior, both of them, in their different ways, purchased for the same reason. Between noon and 3 o'clock the house was yours. The children were at school. Your husband was at work. The casserole was not yet started. And the television, that magnificent glowing rectangle of other people's problems, was entirely available. You watched All My Children with the focused attention of someone studying for an exam. You watched The Guiding Light. You watched women on screen have affairs and dramatic confrontations and breakdowns that came with orchestral music and close-up lighting and a resolution within the half hour, and you noted, with a kind of academic interest, that your own affairs and dramatic confrontations and potential breakdowns would not come with any of that. But the pill made the afternoon soft and golden. You lay on the couch in the good light, and you watched, and you floated. And for a few hours every day, someone else's life was more interesting than yours, which is not a small comfort when you think about it. This soap opera was doing something important that nobody in 1973 was giving it credit for. It was the only place on American television where women's interior lives were treated as the primary subject, not the backdrop, not the supporting context for a man's story, the actual subject. Erica Kane wanted things. She schemed. She suffered. She wore extraordinary clothes while doing both. She had feelings that were large and operatic and entirely her own, and the camera stayed on her face while she had them, which was more than could be said for most of the other hours of the broadcast day. You watched her with the close attention of someone who was seeing something familiar described in a language they didn't know they were fluent in. All My Children had been on the air since 1970. By 1973 it had found its audience, which was statistically you, a demographic of women at home in the afternoon who were college-educated, underutilised, and in possession of feelings that had nowhere in particular to go. Agnes Nixon, who created the show, had done something quietly radical. She'd written characters who talked about their emotions directly, who named what they wanted, who said "I'm unhappy" out loud to another person, and then continued to exist in the story rather than being punished for the admission. You watched this and felt, In the warm pharmaceutical afternoon, something that might have been recognition. The ritual was specific. You changed into comfortable clothes after the children left for school, not the housecoat, something better, a shift dress or slacks, something that said afternoon at home rather than morning before the day, and you made a fresh cup of coffee and you took the good couch cushion, the one that hadn't flattened yet, and you arranged yourself in the particular position that the couch's geometry in your body had negotiated over time. The television warmed up with a slight flicker. The theme music started, and the afternoon, which could have been any number of things, lonely, purposeless, quietly desperate, became instead a place you were going, with people you knew, towards something that would resolve. None of it was real. You knew that clearly, in the part of your mind that the pill didn't reach. Pine Valley was not a real place. Erica Kane's problems were written by a team of people in New York who had decided what would happen next. But the emotions were real in the way that emotions in stories are always real. They are the same emotions, borrowed from real life and given permission to be large, to be seen, to be taken seriously by a camera that never looked away. For 3 hours every afternoon someone was paying attention. You found that in 1973, in a split-level ranch home in a suburb of America, almost impossible to overvalue. The dinner party was the Mount Everest of 1970s suburban womanhood, and you trained for it for 3 days. The menu had to suggest sophistication without implying you were showing off, which meant beef fondue or perhaps a pork tenderloin with an orange glaze that you found in the back of a Good Housekeeping from 1971. You polished the good silverware, you ironed the tablecloth, you wore the hostess gown, the long one in a burnt sienna print, which was a garment that said, "I have made this look effortless," while clearly demonstrating the opposite. The other couples arrived, Tom and Cheryl, Dick and Barbara, your husband's colleague Phil and his wife, whose name you always forgot, and had started privately calling Phil's wife. The women brought wine, the men talked about the economy. You refreshed drinks with a smile that had taken considerable pharmaceutical assistance to achieve and was nonetheless genuinely beautiful. The dinner party in 1973 was a collaborative fiction, and everyone at the table was both the author and the audience. The fiction was, we are sophisticated adults enjoying a pleasant social evening in a well-appointed home. The reality was, 2 of the women had taken something to get through the evening. One of the men was unhappy at work and intended to discuss it at length. One couple had argued in the car on the way over, and the fondue pot had a loose handle that you'd noticed 3 days ago and had not yet mentioned to your husband, which was why you were monitoring it with the focused peripheral attention of someone who knows where the structural weakness is. The table was set with the good dishes, not the everyday Melmac but the actual china, retrieved from the cabinet where it lived in a state of formal retirement between uses. Candles, the centerpiece you had assembled from a Better Homes and Gardens photograph using chrysanthemums from the grocery store, and a bowl you had spray-painted brown. Cloth napkins, ironed, folded into the shape that Diane had shown you, which involved a fold and a tuck that looked casual and required practice. The effect from the doorway was one of effortless elegance. The effort involved in the effortlessness was, by conservative estimate, 11 hours. Dinner itself moved through its prescribed sequence. The cheese and crackers in the living room with cocktails, the migration to the table, the soup course if you were doing soup, the main event, the polite negotiation over seconds, the dessert, which this time was a jello mould with fruit suspended inside it, like a still life preserved in amber, which was the 1970s at its most architecturally ambitious. The conversation stayed in safe territory. The children, the neighbourhood, a movie someone had seen, a news story that everyone had an opinion about as long as the opinion was not too specific. Nobody talked about anything true. Everyone was charming. The pill sat in your bloodstream like a very discreet assistant, keeping the volume at a level you could manage. the smile accessible, the panic at a distance. By 10 o'clock the guests were gone. Your husband stood at the kitchen counter eating the leftover pork tenderloin directly from the dish with a fork, which you had long since stopped commenting on. You washed the good dishes by hand because the good dishes did not go in the dishwasher, which was a rule you had inherited from your mother and never examined. The candles had burned down. The tablecloth needed washing. The fondue pot handle was still loose. You had performed the dinner party, received the reviews. Wonderful evening. You're such a hostess. And now stood alone in the kitchen at 10:15 doing the closing work of the performance, the part that happened after the audience left. You dried the china. You put it back in the cabinet. You turned off the kitchen light. You were very, very good at this, you thought. The question of whether being very good at this was enough was one you left on the counter with a dish towel and went to bed without answering. Children are unreliable narrators, but excellent observers, and your children, who were 7 and 9 respectively and had the unsettling perceptiveness of small private investigators, had begun to develop a theory. The theory was not fully articulated because they were 7 and 9 and lacked the vocabulary, but it existed as a feeling that sometimes Mom moved through the house like she was underwater, and that the afternoons were different from the mornings in a way nobody explained. They adapted the way children do, building their understanding of normal around the evidence available to them. They made their own after-school snacks on the days when you were asleep on the couch. They answered the phone once when you didn't wake up. They were fine, more or less, in the resilient, unsupervised way of children who are learning self-sufficiency earlier than scheduled, which is either character building or concerning depending on which decade you grew up in. Your daughter, who was 9 and had recently become interested in mysteries, both the paperback kind and the household kind, had developed a specific observational practice. She noticed things and filed them in the orderly mental cabinet that would, 2 decades later, make her an excellent project manager, and which currently made her an uncomfortable presence in a house that preferred not to be closely observed. She noticed that the prescription bottle moved between the bathroom cabinet and your purse and the kitchen counter on a rotation she had charted without meaning to. She noticed that you laughed differently in the evenings than in the mornings. She noticed that some days the casserole went in the oven at 4:30, and some days it went in at 6, and that the late casserole days had a particular quality that she couldn't name, but could identify reliably, the way you can identify weather before it arrives. Your son, who was 7 and primarily interested in whether there was anything good on television and whether his sister had touched his things, had a less systematic but equally accurate understanding that was expressed not in observation but in behaviour. On the afternoons when something was off, he became quieter, more self-contained, operating in the smaller radius around his own bedroom rather than the whole house. He watched more television. He asked for fewer things. He had learned, in the efficient way of children who love someone, that certain afternoons were not afternoons to make demands, and he adjusted accordingly, and the adjustment was so quiet and so complete that it was years before anyone noticed he had made it. The children's relationship with the household was, in this way, a kind of weather system. They were both experiencing it and adapting to it simultaneously, building their ideas of what a home was and how people moved through it around the specific home and specific people available to them. This is how all children build their ideas of normal. The question that follows them into adulthood, the one they will spend years in various offices discussing, is whether the normal they inherited was the kind that serves them or the kind that requires renovation. None of this was your fault in any simple sense. You loved your children with the complete, helpless love that is the one unambiguous fact of your life, the one thing that cut through every layer of pharmaceutical softness and landed clean and true. You made the triangled sandwiches. You attended the school events. You kissed the foreheads. You did the things that love looks like when it is expressed through action rather than language, because language for these particular things was not yet fully available to women of your time and situation. You were doing your best with the equipment you'd been given. Your daughter watched from the risers of the school concert. Your son turned the television volume down on the quiet afternoons. They loved you, and they noticed, and they said nothing, in the way that children protect the people they love from the knowledge of what they've seen, which was its own kind of heartbreak, and also its own kind of grace. Dr. Graham occupied a beige office on Maple Street with a fish tank in the waiting room, and framed diplomas arranged with the careful authority of a man who needed you to know he had been to school. He was 55 and wore a tie every day, and had the particular confidence of a medical professional in 1973, which is to say, absolute. When you came in and said you were tired, he nodded. When you said you were anxious, he nodded again, made a note, and reached for his prescription pad with the fluid ease of someone who had done this so many times. The motion had become involuntary, like breathing. He did not ask about your marriage. He did not ask about your sense of self, or your aspirations, or whether you had thought about what you actually wanted from your life. That was not his department. His department was the pad and the pen, and the professional smile, and the comeback in 6 weeks if things aren't improving, which they weren't. But you came back and smiled and said a little better because it seemed like the right thing to say. The waiting room was full of women. You noticed this the second time you came in. Really noticed it. The rows of chairs occupied almost entirely by women in their 30s and 40s, holding their purses in their laps with the particular posture of people who have learned to wait. There were a few older men with the resigned look of cardiac patients, and one young woman with a small child who was systematically dismantling a magazine. But mostly, women. Waiting. For the man with the diplomas to tell them what was wrong and how to manage it. The fish tank hummed. The receptionist called names. The magazines were 6 months old and full of recipes. Dr. Graham was not, by the standards of his time, a bad doctor. He was a product of a medical education that had not, anywhere in its curriculum, suggested that the social conditions of a patient's life were relevant diagnostic information. He had been trained to identify symptoms and match them to treatments, which is a perfectly reasonable system that fails only when the symptom is the treatment, and the treatment is the symptom, and what the patient actually needs is a conversation that his training has not equipped him to have. He was competent, well-meaning, and operating in a professional context that had collectively decided that a nervous housewife was a pharmaceutical problem rather than a structural one. Given this context, he was doing exactly what he was supposed to do. This is not the same as saying what he was doing was right. The appointment lasted 12 minutes. You had timed it, over several visits, with the idle curiosity of someone who has begun taking measurements of her own life. 12 minutes for the questions. How are you sleeping? How is the anxiety? Any side effects? Are you still taking the medication as prescribed? And then the pad, and the pen, and the slip of paper. That was the entire point. That had been the entire point since the first appointment, which had also lasted 12 minutes. You said thank you. He said, have a good week. The fish in the tank moved in their slow circles, indifferent to the entire transaction. What Dr. Graham did not know, or perhaps chose not to examine, was that the 6 women he had seen that morning had all been prescribed the same category of medication, and that the pharmacy 3 blocks away was filling those prescriptions with the frequency of a subscription service. He did not know that his waiting room was functionally a distribution system, or perhaps he knew and considered it standard practice, which was, and this is the haunting part, exactly what it was, standard practice, documented, reimbursed, and unremarkable. The fish turned, the diplomas gleamed. You drove home with a new prescription in your purse and the radio on, and a voice on the AM station said something cheerful and you did not hear what it was. The 1972 Ford LTD Country Squire station wagon was the length of a small ship and the colour of dried mustard, and it was technically yours. It was registered in your husband's name, because most things were, but you drove it every day, and it was yours in the way that anything you spend 6 hours a week inside of becomes yours. You drove the children to school. You drove to the grocery store, to the dry cleaner, to Diane's house for coffee, to the paediatrician, to the school for the thing at the school. You drove in large, slow loops through the geography of your life, which was a circle about 4 miles across, and sometimes, on the way home from somewhere unremarkable, you took a left instead of a right, and drove for a while down a road you didn't need to be on, just to feel the sensation of going somewhere that hadn't been planned, which is not nothing, which is in fact quite a lot. When planned is all you've been doing. The wood grain panels on the sides of the Country Squire were not real wood. They were a printed vinyl decal designed to suggest wood, to evoke wood, to provide the aesthetic comfort of wood without any of the maintenance implications of actual wood, which is, if you think about it, a perfect metaphor for the decade. The car was enormous inside, a bench seat in front wide enough to fit 3 adults without negotiating, a rear-facing back seat over the cargo area where the children sat on long trips facing backwards, watching the world recede rather than approach, which was also, if you think about it, not an inaccurate position. You had learned to drive in a smaller car, a Chevrolet Corvair that belonged to your father and that had a reputation for being slightly homicidal, and the Country Squire was so much larger that the first month you drove it, you had the recurring dream of piloting something that was slowly, gently escaping your control. By the second month you'd calibrated. By the end of the first year you drove it with the easy confidence of someone navigating familiar water, parallel parking it in spaces that made onlookers wince, swinging it through the grocery store lot with the casual authority of a woman who knows exactly how much car she has. The AM radio was the car's best feature. Not because the reception was good, it wasn't. The signal cutting in and out on the back roads with the unreliability of a neighbour who means well, but because it provided a continuous stream of something that wasn't silence. And silence in the station wagon felt different than silence in the house. The house's silence had texture and history and the particular weight of everything that happened in it. The car's silence was just absence, which was easier to manage with a song. You liked Carole King, who had released Tapestry 2 years ago and whose voice did something specific to the part of your chest that held unexpressed things. You played it on 8-track on the long drives, the ones that went nowhere in particular. The left turn, when you took it, usually lasted 20 minutes, sometimes 30. You drove through neighbourhoods you didn't live in, past houses you didn't know, wondering about the people inside them with the idle, unfocused curiosity of someone who has temporarily removed themselves from their own story. It was not escape. The house was still there. The casserole was still expected. The children would be home at 3:15 regardless of which road you drove in the interim. But for 20 minutes the road was new and the radio was playing and the big yellow car moved through unfamiliar streets, and you were, in some small but genuine sense, somewhere else. Every month it arrived in the mailbox, Good Housekeeping, Ladies' Home Journal, McCall's, and every month it told you, with the cheerful authority of a very well-funded friend, exactly how to be happy. The trick, apparently, was gelatin. Also, organisation. Also, a better casserole, a more efficient linen closet, a hostess gown in the right shade of persimmon. The magazines were full of women who smiled in ways that suggested zero pharmaceutical involvement, which you had begun to find personally insulting. They smiled over their pot roasts. They smiled in their spotless kitchens. They smiled next to their smiling husbands, who appeared to have recently said something wonderful. You read them anyway, sitting at the kitchen table with your coffee going cold, turning pages with the half-focused attention of someone who knows the answers aren't in here but keeps checking just in case. The women's magazine of the 1970s was a document of its time in the way that all cultural artifacts are documents of their time, not just in what they showed, but in what they assumed. They assumed that a woman's primary audience was her household. They assumed that the correct response to most problems was a better system, a more organised pantry, a more efficient scheduling method, a decorating technique that would make the living room feel more like a sanctuary. The advice was always practical, always cheerful, always pointing inward. The solution is in here, in the house, in the next project, and never outward, never toward the larger question of why so many women reading these magazines were, by all available evidence, not quite satisfied with the life the magazines kept describing as ideal. The advertising was instructive in its own way. Dishwasher detergent ads featured women who appeared genuinely delighted about the absence of water spots. Floor wax ads showed before and after linoleum with the visual drama usually reserved for medical transformations. There was an ad for a new cleaning product that used the tagline, "Now you can do it all," and it all referred to cleaning the bathroom, the kitchen and the floors, and this was presented as a form of abundance rather than an increase in workload, which tells you everything you need to know about the assumptions running underneath. You read the ads with the practiced eye of someone who has been the target audience for so long that she can see the mechanism even while it operates on her. And yet the magazines contained multitudes if you looked past the gelatin moulds. McCall's had run an article about women returning to work in 1971 that you had clipped and kept in the kitchen drawer for 8 months before throwing it away without entirely knowing why. Ladies' Home Journal had published Can This Marriage Be Saved? For decades, a column so widely read that it had become its own cultural institution, a public window into the private difficulties of marriages that were supposed to be fine, read by millions of women who were supposed to be fine and were quietly relieved to discover they weren't alone. You read the column every month. You never thought it applied to you. This is not because your marriage was fine. It is because the stories in the column always seemed more dramatic, more legible, more conclusively troubled than your own, which was not dramatically troubled, it was quietly troubled, which is a category the column didn't quite cover. Your trouble was not a crisis. It was a climate. And nobody in 1973 had written the article about that yet. You turned the page. There was a recipe for a new kind of jello mould. You made a note to try it. The body is an adaptive organism, which is an impressive quality in most contexts and a deeply inconvenient one in this one. What had, in the beginning, produced a pleasant, rounded softness with a single pill had, by the end of year 2, begun requiring a kind of negotiation. 1 pill produced a mild gentleness. 1.5 pills produced the original effect. 2 pills produced something more like a long afternoon nap interrupted by the distant sounds of a life. You did not make this calculation all at once. You made it incrementally, the way most decisions get made, slowly, then suddenly, with each small adjustment feeling entirely reasonable in the moment and only unreasonable in aggregate. Your doctor, when you mentioned that the prescription seemed less effective, nodded with the infinite calm of a man who was going to write you a slightly stronger prescription and call that problem solving. This is the pharmacology of dependence, and it does not announce itself as dependence. It announces itself as a reasonable adjustment to a changed situation, and reasonable adjustments to changed situations is how most adults manage their lives. So the language is familiar enough to slip past the part of your brain that might otherwise raise a question. You were not taking more pills. You were taking the appropriate number of pills for the current level of your anxiety, which had increased because, and here the reasoning becomes circular in a way that is characteristic of this particular trap, because the pills were no longer managing it as well as they used to. which meant the anxiety was worse, which meant more pills were needed. The circle completed itself daily and felt like logic the entire time. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from a body running slightly too hard on pharmaceutical management, a low-grade tiredness that is different from the tiredness of physical work or the tiredness of poor sleep. It is the tiredness of a system that is constantly being adjusted, constantly being smoothed, constantly being prevented from feeling whatever it would feel if it were left alone to feel it. You were tired in a way that sleep did not fix, which was why the pills had been prescribed in the first place for sleep, which was now being supplemented by more pills because the original pills had stopped producing sleep of the quality required, a development that Dr. Graham found unsurprising and addressed with a second prescription. By 1975, you were taking Quaaludes for the anxiety and a separate prescription for the sleep, and occasionally a third thing for the headaches, which were new and which Dr. Graham attributed to tension, which was correct, though the tension's relationship to the pharmaceutical regimen was not a connection he made explicit. You had become, in the precise language of no one around you, dependent, not in the dramatic sense that the word would later acquire, not in the way that required an intervention or a hospital or a conversation on a television special, but in the quiet, suburban, entirely medically supervised way that was far more common and far less visible. You were not a cautionary tale. You were a patient in good standing with a full medicine cabinet and an organisational system for which pill was taken at which time of day, marked in the small notebook you kept in the kitchen drawer next to the recipe clippings, which is about as 1970s suburban as it is possible to get. The notebook, later, would be one of the things your daughter found. She would hold it for a long time without speaking. Then she would put it down carefully, as if it was something fragile, which it was. 5 o'clock was the cocktail hour, and in the 1970s American suburb the cocktail hour was not a suggestion. It was load-bearing infrastructure. The drinks had names that sounded like they'd been invented at a party where everyone was slightly too warm. Harvey Wallbanger, Tequila Sunrise, Tom Collins, Slow Gin Fizz, a whole vocabulary of sophisticated ease that disguised the fact that everyone was just trying to get from dinner to bedtime with their dignity mostly intact. You made yours in the blender, something orange and cold and deceptively cheerful. Your husband had his scotch, the children had their milk, and the pill, taken at 2, and the drink, begun at 5, produced together a kind of warm, layered numbness that was not happiness exactly, but was at least the absence of the opposite, which in 1973 suburban Ohio was a reasonable approximation. The Harvey Wallbanger, for the record, was vodka, Galliano and orange juice, named after a surfer named Harvey, who allegedly had a habit of banging into walls after drinking too many of them, which is a story that tells you a great deal about the 1970s approach to naming things. It was enormously popular. It appeared in advertisements, on cocktail napkins, in the entertaining guides sold at the checkout counter of grocery stores. There was a Harvey Wallbanger cake, which involved a boxed cake mix and the liqueur, and which you had made once for a PTA fundraiser, because you thought it sounded amusing, and which had been consumed entirely by adults who found the name very funny, and by one child who found it delicious, and did not report this to his parents until several years later. The ritual of the cocktail hour was partly about the drink and mostly about the transition, the official, acknowledged shift from the working part of the day to the social part, from the hours when things were produced to the hours when things were enjoyed. The problem, which was not a problem anyone named, was that for a woman whose working day had no official end, who would be making dinner in an hour and doing dishes after that and getting children into bed after that, the cocktail hour was less a transition and more a brief parenthesis in an ongoing document, a pause that looked like an ending but wasn't. You made the Harvey Wallbanger with the practiced ease of a person who has made the same drink 400 times. Vodka, measured but generously. Galliano, a thin golden pour. Orange juice from the can in the refrigerator, not fresh squeezed because fresh squeezed was for weekends. Ice. Stir. The blender on Tuesdays when you felt like something frothy. You brought your husband his scotch without being asked because after 9 years you knew the timing and the glass and the amount. This specific knowledge of another person that accumulates over a long shared life, whether the life is what you wanted or not. The 5 o'clock window in winter had a particular light, the sun already behind the houses across the street, the sky going orange and then purple and then dark in the 40 minutes between when the children came in from outside and when dinner went on the table. You stood at the kitchen counter with your Harvey Wallbanger and watched this happen through the window over the sink most evenings. The sky doing something beautiful and temporary outside while the house continued its operations around you, and you drank your drink and let the combined pharmaceutical and alcoholic warmth do its quiet work, and some evenings that was almost enough, and the almost was something you had learned to live inside. The Parent-Teacher Association met on the 3rd Tuesday of every month in the school gymnasium, and attendance was not mandatory in any legal sense, and absolutely mandatory in every social sense, and you knew the difference. You dressed for the PTA meeting with the careful consideration of someone preparing for a low-stakes but somehow crucial diplomatic engagement. Slacks, not too casual, blouse, not too formal, hair done, not too done. You sat in the rows of folding chairs that smelled of gym floor and mild ambition, and you listened to Mrs. Patterson discuss the upcoming book fair with an intensity generally reserved for treaty negotiations. You raised your hand to volunteer for the bake sale table because you had excellent baked goods, and also because volunteering for the bake sale table was the fastest path to leaving the meeting early, and sometimes the most sophisticated strategy is the simplest one. The PTA gymnasium on a Tuesday evening was a specific kind of social environment. 60 parents in folding chairs performing their interest in institutional proceedings while actually conducting the real business of the evening, which was observing each other. Who had come? Who hadn't? Who had brought the husband? Which signalled either a strong marriage or an unusual degree of domestic participation. Who was sitting with whom, and what that implied about the neighbourhood's social geography this month, which shifted the way weather shifts slowly, then with sudden drama around a specific event that everyone would refer to for years afterward as the thing with the Hendersons. You were good at PTA meetings in the way you were good at most social performances, present, engaged, reliably contributing without ever becoming the centre of attention. You raised your hand for the bake sale and the class party coordination, and occasionally the spring fair committee, which was a larger commitment than you needed but produced a schedule of organised tasks that gave the weeks leading up to it a satisfying structure. The tasks were legible and completable. You completed them. This produced the specific satisfaction of a person who has done a thing and can observe the thing being done, which was a satisfaction available in your life only in the domestic and volunteer contexts, which is perhaps why you volunteered. Mrs. Patterson ran the meetings with the organised energy of a woman who had found, in PTA leadership, an outlet for ambitions that had been redirected from wherever they had originally been pointed. She used a podium. She had a gavel that she deployed more often than the situation strictly required. She distributed agendas on mimeographed sheets that smelled of that particular chemical scent. An entire generation's institutional memory encoded in a smell, and she moved through the agenda with the focused determination of someone who believes deeply that the book fair matters, which she did, and it did, in the way that all the small administrative machinery of a community matters. The maintenance work, the organisational work, the work of showing up and paying attention so that the thing continues to function. This work was done almost entirely by women, Nobody mentioned this. You drove home afterward through streets quiet with 9 o'clock, the children already in bed, your husband watching something on television, and you sat for a moment in the driveway before going in the dark car with the engine off, in the specific silence of a car in a suburban driveway at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday, and you thought, I did all the things today, every single thing, and you had. You absolutely had. You got out of the car and went inside. Here is the great irony of sedatives prescribed for insomnia. They could make you sleepy during the day with no difficulty whatsoever, but left you lying awake at 2 in the morning with a specific quiet clarity that felt almost cruel. You lay in the dark next to your husband, who slept with the committed thoroughness of someone with no unresolved questions, and you stared at the ceiling and thought about things you did not have a name for yet. Not sadness exactly, not anger. Something more like the sense of standing at the edge of a very large question you'd never been invited to ask. The ceiling provided no answers. It had been there before you and would be there after, indifferent and smooth, painted a colour called antique white, which was really just white with an excuse. You lay there, thinking. Eventually you took another pill. Eventually you slept. In the morning you made the eggs. The 2 o'clock ceiling is a specific geography that anyone who has ever lived inside insomnia will recognise immediately. It is not just a ceiling. It is a surface onto which the mind projects, in the absence of anything else to do, every thought that the daylight hours were too busy to accommodate. The grocery list items you forgot. The thing you said at the dinner party that landed wrong and that everyone else has certainly forgotten but that you have been replaying in a loop since it happened. The larger, shapeless concerns that don't have a specific content but have a weight, a general pressing sense that something is not right, that some accounting is coming, that the life being lived and the life that was possible are not the same, life and the gap between them is getting harder to not look at directly. The pharmaceutical irony is real and documented. Quaaludes, like many sedative hypnotics, could produce what pharmacologists call rebound anxiety, a withdrawal of the drug's calming effect that left the nervous system temporarily more agitated than it would have been without the drug at all. So the thing prescribed for the anxiety produced, at 2 in the morning, a sharpened version of the anxiety, which would then require another pill to manage, which would produce morning grogginess, which would require coffee and possibly another half pill to get through the morning, which would make the afternoon drowsy, which would be managed with another pill, and the cycle ran itself with the self-sustaining logic of a machine that has learned how to keep itself going. You were not aware of any of this mechanically. You were aware of it experientially, which is a much lonelier kind of knowledge. What you thought about at 2 in the morning varied. Sometimes it was specific and small. The children's shoes needed replacing. The gutters needed cleaning. Your mother had called twice, and you had returned the call once, and she had sounded like she wanted to say something she didn't say. Sometimes it was larger and less articulable. The photograph on the dresser, the girl laughing on the college steps, the particular quality of a life that had felt, at 21, full of direction, and felt now full of content, but somehow emptied of direction, which not the same thing, and the difference between them was what the ceiling was made of at 2 in the morning. Your husband slept beside you, a warm, unconscious fact. You did not wake him. Waking him would require explaining what was wrong, and what was wrong was not the kind of thing that could be explained in the dark to a man who would listen with genuine concern and then not know what to do, which would make you feel worse, which seemed unkind. So you lay there. You took the pill when the lying there became unbearable. You watched the ceiling go from dark to slightly less dark as the night progressed toward morning, and eventually the birds started somewhere outside, and then the sky went grey, and then you were asleep for exactly the 2 hours before the alarm, which was its own kind of joke, delivered nightly by a universe with an extremely dry sense of humour. There was a photograph on the dresser, you, at 21, sitting on the steps of a college building you no longer remember the name of, laughing at something, wearing a dress that moved in the wind. You had been studying literature. You had planned to do something with that, though the details had grown imprecise over the decade. You looked at the photograph sometimes while sitting at the vanity doing your makeup, and you regarded the laughing girl in the photograph with the complicated affection of someone who recognizes someone they used to know very well and have since entirely lost track of. She had wanted things. The wanting had been specific and vivid, and it had felt at the time like information, like the wanting meant something would happen. You patted pressed powder on your nose. You looked at yourself in the mirror, which was you now, and you found her perfectly acceptable, and you found that verdict depressing in a way you couldn't fully explain. The vanity was a piece of furniture with a specific function. It was where you assembled the version of yourself that would go out into the day. Foundation, powder, a line of mascara, the coral lipstick from the Avon lady that you'd been using for 3 months and that had, in that time, become what you thought of as your colour. The one that looked like a decision rather than a default. The mirror was honest in the particular way of mirrors that are well lit and angled correctly, which is to say, more honest than you sometimes wanted. You were 31. You looked 31, which was not old by any objective measure, and felt some mornings like a verdict. The girl in the photograph was a different person in the ways that matter, and the same person in the ways that confuse you. She had the same jaw, the same tendency to hold her shoulders slightly too high when she was uncertain, the same way of laughing with her whole face that you had since learned to moderate into something more contained and appropriate for a woman of your current social position. She'd been studying Middlemarch, and their eyes were watching God, and a selection of contemporary poetry that her professor had assured her was important, and she'd read all of it with the voracious, non-instrumental pleasure of someone reading purely because the reading itself was the point, which was a relationship with books you had not had time to maintain and missed in the specific low-grade way. You miss things that were good for you when you've been too busy to attend to them. She had wanted to write. This is the detail you circled back to in the 2 o'clock ceiling hours, with the particular persistence of an unfinished sentence. Not to be a writer in the capital letter sense, not necessarily, just to write, to make something with language, to find out if she had something to say that was worth the saying. She'd kept a journal through college that she had stopped keeping the year after the wedding, not because anything dramatic ended it, but because the days had filled with other content, and the journal had gone into a drawer and the drawer had closed, and the habit had simply evaporated in the way that habits evaporate, when the life around them changes shape. The journal was still in the drawer. You'd seen it twice in the past year while looking for something else. Both times you'd closed the drawer without taking it out. Not because you were afraid of what was in it. The entries were from a decade ago. They were not threatening, but because taking it out would mean deciding something about it, and deciding something about it would mean acknowledging that there was a decision to be made, and acknowledging that there was a decision to be made was the kind of thing that happened at 2 a.m, and not, apparently, in the morning, with the eggs on and the children's shoes to locate, and the day already running. You put your lipstick on. You found the girl in the mirror acceptable. You went downstairs. It didn't happen all at once. It rarely does. It happened the way the tide comes in, so gradually you don't notice until your feet are wet and the chair is an island. The first sign, which you did not identify as a sign at the time, was sleeping through your daughter's school concert. Not all of it, just the first half, in the 3rd row, with your chin on your chest and your programme slipping from your fingers, which your daughter saw from the risers, and which she did not mention then, and mentioned once, briefly, 16 years later, in a therapist's office in a different city. The second sign was the bottle that ran out a week early twice in a row. The third sign was the thing your husband said, standing in the kitchen doorway in his work clothes, holding your prescription bottle and looking at you with an expression you had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not disappointment exactly, but something worse, which was worry. He was worried. He had finally noticed something. You were not in that moment sure whether to be relieved or furious. The school concert had been a Tuesday in November. The gymnasium again, folding chairs arranged in rows facing a riser's setup, draped in blue fabric that the music teacher, Mr. Kowalski, had assembled with the cheerful optimism of someone who believed very strongly in the transformative power of a good backdrop. The children's choir wore white shirts. Your daughter was in the second row from the top, which you knew because you had helped her find her spot during the afternoon rehearsal, and which you therefore knew was visible from the third row of the audience, which is where you'd been sitting when you had not been visible to her in any meaningful sense because your chin was on your chest and your eyes were closed. You woke to applause, the specific, horrible experience of waking to applause in a public space, the disorientation, the immediate and absolute understanding of what has happened, the performance of waking gracefully that your body attempted while your brain was still catching up. You clapped. You looked at the risers. Your daughter was looking at you from the second row with an expression that was carefully, heartbreakingly neutral, the expression of a 9-year-old who has decided to give you the benefit of something. You smiled at her. She looked away. The choir sang 2 more songs. You did not sleep through them. The prescription bottle running out early is a thing that happens by degrees so small that each one is invisible. 1 extra half pill on a difficult afternoon, an additional one on the night before the dinner party, when the anxiety was higher than usual. A full extra dose on the evening that you and your husband had the argument about something you have since forgotten the content of, but remember the quality of. The specific, flattened-out argument of 2 people who are arguing about a surface thing, because the real thing is too large and too complicated to approach directly. Each individual decision was reasonable in its specific context. The aggregate was the problem, and aggregates are only visible in retrospect, which is the condition under which most damage is assessed. Your husband held the bottle on a Thursday morning in February, and he looked at you, and something in his face had changed in a way that could not be undone. He did not shout. He set the bottle down. He said, very quietly, "I think we need to talk to someone." And the something that had been pressing against the walls of the household for 2 years, the shape without a name, the weather rather than an event, finally quietly broke through. It was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was 2 people standing in a kitchen in the early morning, and one of them had finally looked at what was there, and the other one was, for the first time in a very long time, not alone with it, which was terrifying. And also, underneath the terror, something else, something that would take a while to identify. But it was there. Diane saw the most. Diane was the kind of woman who noticed things and stored them with the careful organisation of someone who had spent years archiving information she wasn't sure how to use. She noticed that you had started wearing sunglasses to the Tuesday coffee circle, even when there was no sun. She noticed that you had stopped making the streusel coffee cake and started bringing store-bought Danish, which nobody said anything about but everyone processed as data. She noticed the 3 times you called to cancel at the last minute, citing headaches. She noticed the way you laughed a half-second too late at jokes, the underwater delay of someone listening through a long-distance connection. And Diane said nothing, because in 1973 in a suburb of Ohio, saying something was the most dangerous thing a woman could do to another woman, and saying nothing was also dangerous, and everyone understood this, and everyone said nothing anyway, and that was the agreement, and also the trap. Diane's house was the centre of the social world of the street in the way that some houses simply are, by virtue of the personality of the person inside them. It was not a better house than the others, same split-level architecture, same harvest gold sectional, but it felt different inside, warmer, as if Diane's particular quality of attention had settled into the walls over the years and made them more hospitable. People felt seen in Diane's living room, which was either a gift or a liability depending on what you were trying to hide, and in the winter of 1974 you were trying to hide quite a lot. The other women noticed things too, in the distributed way that a social group notices things, each person holding a piece of the picture without quite assembling the whole. Carol had remarked to Barbara, not to you, that you seemed tired lately, which was Carol's vocabulary for a wider range of observations. Barbara had noticed the sunglasses. Patty, who was less perceptive about most things, had nonetheless observed that you had hugged her goodbye at the last coffee circle with more force than usual. The hug of someone who needed the contact, and she had filed this away in the undifferentiated category of things she noticed but did not know what to do with, which was a category most people maintained without naming. The etiquette of noticing in 1973 suburban America was precise and unwritten. You could notice. You could not say you noticed. Not directly. Not "I'm worried about you. I think something is wrong," which would require the person being worried about to confirm or deny, which would require her to either lie or tell the truth, and both options were exposing in ways that the social contract of the coffee circle was not designed to accommodate. What you could do, what was permitted, what was even generous within the rules, was make yourself slightly more available. Offer an extra coffee refill. Ask a follow-up question. Linger near the door when someone was leaving space for something to be said if something wanted to be said. Diane did this. In the months when things were at their worst, Diane called on Wednesdays, not Tuesdays, just to check in, just to say she'd been thinking about you, just to let the phone ring long enough that there was room for something to be answered honestly, if you chose to answer it honestly, which you did not yet, but which you remembered later as a kindness that had weight, that had helped in ways Diane probably never knew. The neighbours saw, they did not say. And in the silence between the seeing and the saying, a form of care existed that was imperfect and insufficient, and also, in the specific language available to them, the best they had. The story does not end at the bottom. That is important to say, because stories about pills and suburbs and quiet desperation have a tendency to end in tragedy in the way that serves a narrative, and this one does not end there. What happened, in many cases, with many women, was something slower and harder and more interesting than tragedy. It was waking up. The process was not graceful. It involved a conversation with a husband who had finally clumsily said the right thing. It involved a different doctor, possibly a female one, who asked questions that the previous doctor had not asked, and then sat quietly while you answered them. It involved a period of weeks that were very uncomfortable in the specific way that discomfort feels when it is real and unmedicated, and therefore also, for the first time in years, honest. And it involved the slow, strange process of finding out who was underneath, what was left when the softening was removed, what the woman wanted, what she had always wanted, what she was still, improbably, in time to become. The new doctor's name was Dr. Carol Whitfield, and she practiced out of a small office on a different street from Dr. Graham's, referred by a woman at the PTA who had mentioned her name in passing with a particular emphasis of someone communicating something larger than the words. Dr. Whitfield was 43 and wore sensible shoes, and did not have a fish tank in her waiting room, which you noticed with an irrational but genuine relief. Her waiting room had plants. Real ones, the kind that required actual attention to keep alive, which said something about the person inside, though you were not sure exactly what. The first appointment was 45 minutes, which was 3 times as long as any appointment with Dr. Graham had ever been. She asked about the prescription history. She asked about sleep, about anxiety, about the days and what they contained and what they felt like from the inside. She asked, and this was the question that made something in your chest shift, that made your eyes fill unexpectedly in the office of a doctor you had met 20 minutes ago?" she asked. "What did you want to be before this? Before this?" The phrase was so precisely right that you could not speak for a moment. Before this. As if the life you were living and the life you had imagined were two distinct territories with a border between them, and she had just named the border, and naming it made it real, and real was the beginning of being able to do something about it. Coming off Quaaludes was not pleasant. It was a process supervised by Dr. Whitfield over several months. A gradual reduction in dosage that your body registered as a long, low-grade complaint, restlessness, disrupted sleep, a return of the anxiety in its original unmedicated form, which was uncomfortable and also, underneath the discomfort, oddly clarifying. The anxiety meant something. It was not a malfunction. It was information, pointed at something specific, and when you stopped managing it pharmaceutically, you were left with the necessity of figuring out what it was pointing at, which was the harder work and also the more useful one. The journal came out of the drawer in the spring of 1975. You did not make a ceremony of it. You simply took it out one afternoon when the house was quiet and sat at the kitchen table and opened to a blank page past all the old entries, and you wrote one sentence: "I am trying to figure out what I want." Then you closed it. But you put it on the counter instead of back in the drawer, which was the important part. The next day you wrote another sentence. The day after, 2 sentences. By the end of the month, a page. By the end of the year, something that was beginning, in the early uncertain way of first drafts, to look like a life being examined and revised, and slowly, stubbornly, reclaimed. Quaaludes were not the only pharmaceutical running through the veins of suburban womanhood in the 1970s, and if you think this story is about one pill, you have underestimated the creativity of the American medical establishment. Valium, diazepam, 5 milligrams, yellow tablet, small enough to hide in a compact, was prescribed to American women at twice the rate of men throughout the decade, a statistic that tells you everything you need to know about who the medical community thought was anxious and who it thought was simply busy. The Rolling Stones had already written a song about it, Mother's Little Helper, 1966, which was less a warning and more an inadvertent advertisement. By the time the 1970s were in full swing, Valium was the most prescribed drug in the entire United States. Your neighbour had some. Your sister-in-law had some. Your doctor's waiting room was full of women who were going to leave with some. It was, in the language of the time, perfectly normal, which is the most dangerous phrase in the English language when applied to something that probably isn't. The yellow tablet was Roche's 5 milligram formulation, and the blue tablet was 10 milligrams. And if you knew the difference by sight, it was because the social circulation of these pharmaceuticals in 1970s suburban America meant that they passed between women the way recipes pass between women, offered with the same intention, with the same genuine desire to help, with the same casual authority of someone sharing something that has worked for them personally, not sold, given, at the coffee circle, in the parking lot after school pickup over the fence between yards. Have you tried this? It really helps. My doctor gave it to me last spring. The doctor's name offered and received, like a referral, which is what it was. This informal network was not secret in the way that illegal things are secret. It was private in the way that women's business was private in 1973, conducted in the spaces between the official world, which was run by and for the other half of the population, and the actual daily world, which was managed by women with whatever tools were available. The tools available included pharmaceuticals, and the pharmaceuticals were distributed through channels that were technically medical and socially communal, and the combination produced something that was neither fully legitimate nor remotely underground, floating in the ambiguous middle space that a lot of 1970s womanhood occupied. The statistics, when they eventually became public, were staggering in their implications. In 1978, At the peak of Valium's prescription rates, American doctors wrote approximately 60 million prescriptions for the drug in a single year. 60 million. In a country of 220 million people. If you divided that number by the adult female population, you arrived at a figure that suggested the medical establishment had quietly decided that being a woman in 1973 America was, in and of itself, a condition requiring treatment. Nobody held a press conference to announce this conclusion. It emerged from 60 million individual appointments, each one lasting 12 minutes, each one ending with a prescription, each one individually reasonable and collectively a portrait of a society that had medicated its way around a structural problem rather than looking at the structure. You were part of this network and not part of it, simultaneously. You had your own prescription. You'd given a pill once, just once, to Carol at the coffee circle on a morning when Carol was visibly unravelling in the specific way of someone with 3 children under 6 and no sleep and no help and no language for what she was experiencing. You had pressed it into her hand without ceremony, the way you'd hand someone a tissue. Carol had taken it. Neither of you mentioned it afterward. It was the economy of survival between women, and it was also, depending on how you looked at it, a failure of something larger that nobody had yet found the name for. Betty Crocker was not a real woman. She was invented in 1921 by a flour company as a way to put a comforting female face on corporate cooking advice, and she had been watching you from the spine of her cookbook ever since, with the expression of a woman who has never once burned anything and would like you to know it. Her cookbook, the red one, the one every American kitchen owned like a municipal requirement, was less a recipe book and more a philosophical position, that a woman's highest expression was a perfectly risen bundt cake, that love was measured in cups and tablespoons, and that the correct response to any emotional difficulty was probably a new casserole variation. You had followed her instructions for years with the devotion of someone who'd been told the instructions were the point, and not merely instructions. The bundt cake rose, the casseroles were consumed, the following of instructions continued. Betty watched from the shelf with her painted smile. You occasionally wanted to turn the book face down. General Mills had introduced Betty in response to a promotional contest in which thousands of women submitted entries signed with a female name, because a woman's endorsement of a flour company felt more trustworthy than a corporation's, which reveals something about 1920s marketing psychology that also describes 1970s marketing psychology, and possibly all marketing psychology. They had created a composite portrait from the signatures of their female employees, added a red suit and a pleasant, authoritative expression, and Betty had been advising American women on their domestic inadequacy ever since, periodically updated to reflect the current decade's standards while always maintaining the essential message: you could do better, and here is how. The cookbook itself was a remarkable object. The 1970s edition ran to over 400 pages and covered everything from the correct way to fold an omelette to the architecture of a proper dinner party timeline, laid out with the sequential precision of a military operation. The recipes were reliable, which was the cookbook's primary virtue and also its primary limitation. Reliable within a very specific conception of what food was for, which was sustenance, economy, and the performance of domestic competence. There were no recipes for cooking as pleasure. There were no recipes that acknowledged that the person making the food might be tired or resentful or both. The assumption was that the cook was motivated by love and organised by efficiency, and if the cook was not feeling particularly motivated by love on a Wednesday, the cookbook had nothing to say about that, which was a significant gap in coverage. The Jell-O mould section was its own chapter, and it deserves acknowledgement here as one of the more bewildering culinary developments of the 20th century. The 1970s American Jell-O mould, suspended fruit, layered colours, occasionally savoury in a way that suggested a dare, was presented in the Betty Crocker cookbook and in every women's magazine of the era as an achievement, something to bring to a dinner party with pride, something to photograph and serve on the good china. You had made at least a dozen of them. They had been consumed. Nobody had complained. Whether anybody had actually enjoyed them in a genuine, unreserved way was information you did not have. The cookbook lived on the shelf between the Fanny Farmer and a spiral-bound community cookbook from the church that contained 47 variations on green bean casserole and a hot dish recipe submitted by a woman named Lorraine that called for 3 cans of cream of mushroom soup, and which you had made without irony and would make again. Betty watched from her red spine. You had long since stopped consulting her for the casseroles which you made from memory. But you kept her there. Old habits of authority are hard to shelve. Somewhere out there, in New York, in Boston, in universities and offices and magazines with names that hadn't existed 5 years ago, women were having a very loud conversation about the precise nature of your situation, and the conversation was making its way slowly, like a radio signal through mountains, into the living rooms of split-level ranch homes across the American interior. You had heard about the women's liberation movement, the way you heard about most things in 1973, through your husband's newspaper, which covered it with the anxious energy of someone reporting on a weather system they didn't know how to classify. You had read half of The Feminine Mystique, stopping somewhere in the middle at a passage that described your life so accurately that you put the book face down on the nightstand and did not pick it up again for 2 weeks, because it had named something you'd been successfully not naming for years, and naming it made it real. And real was a significant step up from theoretical, and you were not sure you were ready for that step, but you were also, increasingly, not sure you could avoid it. Betty Friedan had published The Feminine Mystique in 1963, which meant that by 1973 it had been sitting on the nightstands and in the bottom drawers of American women for a decade, its arguments spreading through the culture with the patient, insistent energy of an idea whose time had arrived and knew it. The argument was simple and devastating, that the domestic role assigned to American women was not the fulfillment it was advertised to be, that the education and intelligence and ambition of a generation of women had been funneled into a narrowing channel called housewifery, and that the quiet dissatisfaction this produced, the anxiety, the restlessness, the sense that something was missing from a life that was supposed to be complete, was not a personal failing but a structural condition. She called it the problem that has no name, which was the single most precisely accurate phrase applied to your interior life that you had ever encountered in print. The problem with The Feminine Mystique, and this is the thing that made you put it face down on the nightstand rather than finishing it, was that it named the problem without resolving the question of what you were supposed to do about it on a Tuesday in Ohio with 2 children and casserole in the oven and a husband who meant well and a prescription bottle in the cabinet and a life that was, by every external measure, a success. Friedan was talking to you, but the conversation she was starting required decisions that you were not yet equipped to make. The book sat face down for 2 weeks. When you picked it up again, you finished it in 2 sittings, and you lay on the couch afterward in the afternoon light and stared at the ceiling for a long time, not sleeping, just thinking, which was the beginning of something you couldn't yet identify. Gloria Steinem was on the cover of New York Magazine. Ms. Magazine launched in 1972 and arrived, eventually, at the house of someone on your street who left it out at the coffee circle once, and you read 3 articles in 45 minutes while Diane refilled everyone's coffee, and you thought about those articles for weeks. Something was happening. You understood. A conversation you had not been invited to was now, slowly, being held loudly enough that the invitation had become irrelevant. The conversation was simply happening, whether you attended or not, and the question was what you were going to do about the fact that it was describing your life to you from the outside with a clarity and an accuracy that your own interior life had been unable to produce. You were not yet sure what the answer was, but the question finally had been asked out loud, and so here we are, at the end of a day in the life of a woman whose name you never knew, but whose kitchen you have spent the last several hours inside. A woman who woke before the sun, who made the eggs and ironed the tablecloth and cut the sandwiches into triangles, because triangles read as effort, who smiled at the right moments and kept the house running with the invisible, load-bearing competence of someone who has been told her whole life that invisible is the highest compliment. She was not a cautionary tale. She was not a tragedy. She was a person living inside the only set of options her time and place had made available to her, doing her best with a medicine cabinet that her doctor had stocked, and a life that her culture had designed, and a self that was, underneath all of it, stubbornly, quietly, persistently trying to get back to the surface. There were millions of her. In split-level ranch homes on streets with names like Meadowbrook and Willow Glen, in avocado green kitchens all across the American interior, women were managing the unmanageable with whatever tools came to hand, were watching soap operas in the afternoon light and writing things in journals they kept in drawers, were making casseroles and driving long loops in mustard yellow station wagons and sitting at coffee circles where everyone knew more than anyone said. They were doing the work that kept the world running, the children and the dinners and the folding chairs at the PTA, and they were also, slowly and without announcements, beginning to ask for something more. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the question had been asked, and questions, once asked, do not unask themselves. The 1970s were not the worst of times for women in America, and they were not the best of times. They were a decade of transition, which is another way of saying a decade of standing in a doorway, one foot in the old room and one foot in the new one, with the full weight of everything that had been on one side and the uncertain, terrifying, necessary possibility of everything that could be on the other. She made it through. Not cleanly, not without cost, but through. So tonight, as you sink into your clean sheets in a world where women can have bank accounts in their own names and jobs that require briefcases and opinions that don't need to be softened before delivery, maybe take a moment to think about the woman in the avocado green kitchen. The one who lay awake at 2 a.m. staring at the antique white ceiling, with a bottle in the cabinet and a journal in the drawer, and a self she was still, at 31, in the process of locating. She figured it out. It took longer than it should have, in a world that was better organised for her difficulty than for her success. But she got there. She always gets there. Because history is full of women who were handed a smaller life than they deserved, and who made something extraordinary out of it anyway, not because the smallness was fine, but because they refused in the end to be only as large as the space they had been given. Put the phone down now, close your eyes, the casserole is done, the house is quiet, the journal is on the counter, open to a blank page, waiting. You can. Write in it tomorrow. Good night.